He married her in the morning, and by sunset he could not stop thinking about the woman he left behind. The words drifted through the moonlit hall like a prophecy no one wanted to name. In the western wing of Blackridge Keep, where the candles burned low and the windows looked out over the forest, Mara stood alone with her hands folded so tightly in front of her that her fingers had gone pale. She had not been invited to the royal celebration. In fact, no one had called her by name in years. To the pack, she was only the forgotten mate, the girl who had once stood closest to the Alpha King and then vanished into silence. Tonight, while the music swelled beyond the stone walls, she pressed a small tray of fresh tea against her apron and tried to steady her breathing. The kitchen maid who had sent her here said the king's guests were expecting service. Mara had simply nodded, because nodding was easier than explaining that she knew this castle better than anyone thought. She moved through the corridor with quiet steps, her head lowered, her dark braid resting against the back of her dress. The scent of cedar and firewood clung to the air, mixed with roasted herbs from the banquet below. Then she heard it. Laughter. Sharp. Controlled. Royal. And beneath it, the low voice she had once learned to recognize before she knew her own heartbeat. The Alpha King was speaking. Mara stopped just outside the open archway, unseen in the shadow. Through the candlelight, she saw him at the far end of the hall, tall and composed in a dark formal coat, one hand resting near the goblet before him. Beside him stood another woman, radiant in silver silk, her smile polished and bright enough to blind everyone who looked at her. She was laughing at something the king had said, and the entire room seemed to lean toward them as if the world itself had chosen a new center. Mara's chest tightened. She had heard the rumors, of course. That he had finally taken a wife. That the court had celebrated for 3 full days. That the old bond, the one people whispered had been broken and buried, no longer mattered. She had told herself she did not care. But the truth moved through her like winter. He looked older now, harder around the eyes, carrying the heavy stillness of a ruler who had learned to survive his own loneliness. Then, as if pulled by something he did not understand, his gaze shifted. It crossed the hall. Past the guests. Past the candles. And landed on her. Mara forgot how to breathe. The king did not move, but something changed in his face, something so sudden and human that the woman beside him followed his stare and frowned. The room seemed to grow quieter, the music softer, the fire dimmer. He stared at Mara as if the air itself had broken open. As if he had just seen a ghost wearing her own face. And somewhere deep inside him, buried beneath duty and ceremony and the life he had chosen, one thought rose with devastating clarity: he had remembered. He did not speak her name. Not at first. He only stared as the hall continued around him, as if every sound in the room had been pushed far away by the force of that one impossible glance. Mara felt it like heat on her skin. Not comfort. Not peace. The kind of heat that came before a storm, bright and dangerous and impossible to ignore. She lowered her eyes at once, because that was what years had taught her to do. Do not look too long. Do not hope too quickly. Do not mistake a moment of attention for mercy. But the king was already moving. Not fast. Not dramatically. Just one measured step, then another, until the people between them seemed to thin under the weight of his focus. The woman at his side touched his arm and said something soft, but he did not answer. His attention stayed fixed on Mara, and that alone was enough to draw the room into silence one breath at a time. Mara could feel the judgment before it came. She knew the shape of it. A forgotten woman had no place in a royal hall. A woman left behind had no right to stand near the light. Yet the king kept looking at her as if he were trying to remember the exact moment the world had split in two. His jaw tightened. His expression changed, subtle and deep, like someone waking from a long and bitter sleep. Then, at last, he spoke, and his voice was low enough that only the nearest guests heard it. "You," he said, and the single word carried more weight than any title. Mara's throat closed. It had been so long since anyone in power had addressed her with anything other than dismissal that the sound nearly undid her. The woman beside him looked from one to the other, her polished smile faltering for the first time. Across the hall, a few courtiers exchanged uneasy glances, already sensing that something delicate and dangerous had begun to shift. Mara wished she could move. Wished she could disappear into the shadows where she had spent so many years. But the king was still looking at her as though the rest of the world had gone hollow. As though her face had unlocked something he had buried too deep to survive. He took another step, and the gold light from the chandeliers caught the edge of his crown. For one suspended second, he looked less like a ruler and more like a man standing at the edge of a terrible truth. And then his gaze dropped, not to her hands or her dress, but to the faint mark at her wrist, hidden until now beneath the sleeve she had kept carefully lowered. His face went still. The color drained from his eyes. He knew that mark. Not as a memory. As a promise. Mara saw the recognition strike him with sudden force, and her own pulse stumbled in answer. Whatever had been buried was not buried anymore. It had found its way back into the light. Mara had learned how to survive a room without being seen, and that habit stayed with her now, even with the king looking at her like the world had shifted under his feet. She stood very still beside the polished table, her fingers resting lightly on the edge as if the wood could lend her steadiness. Around them, the banquet had not fully recovered. Voices continued in fragments. Glasses touched. Soft music moved through the hall. Yet all of it felt distant, blurred by the silence stretching between Mara and the man who had once belonged to her future, then vanished from it without warning. He had a wife now. Everyone knew it. The new queen sat at his side in silk and jewels, her posture perfect, her smile careful, her eyes moving from the king to Mara with a sharpness that did not need words. Mara felt that look and lowered her gaze even more. She had no desire to challenge anyone. She had not come here to be noticed. She had come because duty had left her no choice, and because leaving would have meant answering too many questions she could not bear to answer. The king took one step closer. Then another. Each movement was measured, but there was nothing calm about the way his attention remained fixed on her face. He was looking at her as if he were searching for the shape of a life he had lost. Mara could feel the weight of it in her chest. It made breathing difficult. It made the hall seem smaller than it had been a moment before. His mouth opened slightly, as if he might speak her name at last, but no sound came out. Instead, his eyes dropped again to her wrist, to the faint mark there, and something in him changed so suddenly that even the air seemed to tighten. The queen at his side noticed it too. She set her glass down with a soft, precise motion and turned her head just enough to follow his stare. For a brief second, her expression remained composed. Then she saw what he saw. The mark. The recognition. The impossible truth beginning to rise between them. Mara did not move. She could not. The king's breathing had changed, subtle but unmistakable, as if he had been struck by a memory too powerful to ignore. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that only the nearest tables might have heard the sound, and even then it was hardly more than a stunned exhale. "Where did you get that?" Mara's throat tightened. Years ago, that same question had meant nothing. Now it carried the weight of everything left unfinished. She lifted her eyes just enough to meet his, and in that small, dangerous instant, she saw the same thing she had once loved in him and the same thing she had feared, a man who had finally realized he had been wrong. Not about politics. Not about ceremony. About her. The queen shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. A few guests had begun to sense the change as well. Conversations thinned. Heads turned. The hall, so full a moment ago, seemed to hold its breath with them. Mara felt exposed beneath all those watching eyes, but she also felt something else, something stranger and quieter. Not hope. Not yet. Only the fragile beginning of being seen. The king's gaze remained on her wrist, then rose slowly to her face, and this time there was no distance in it at all. Only shock. Only regret. Only the terrible understanding that some doors, once opened by memory, could never be closed again. The silence in the banquet hall did not break all at once. It thinned, like mist burned away by first light, until every glance seemed to turn toward Mara and every breath in the room felt measured against the king's reaction. He remained standing, his hands still hovering near the table as if he had risen too quickly to trust his own balance. The queen beside him had gone perfectly still, her expression held in place by training, but her eyes had sharpened with something colder than surprise. Mara could feel it all without looking directly at anyone. She had spent too many years learning how to read a room by the shape of its silence. And this silence was dangerous. It carried memory. It carried regret. It carried the terrible possibility that the past was no longer willing to stay buried. The king's gaze returned to her wrist again, and something in his face tightened, as though the sight of that mark had struck a hidden wound inside him. Mara kept her chin level. She would not shrink now, not after surviving everything that had brought her here. The polished table between them reflected the golden candlelight, but it could not soften the distance that had once been built by his choice. She saw him swallow once, then again, the movement barely visible, yet enough to tell her the truth. He was not looking at a stranger. He was looking at a mistake that had learned how to stand on its own. That truth settled over the hall in waves. One noble lowered his cup without drinking. Another turned sharply to whisper into a sleeve. Somewhere near the musicians, a note faltered before recovering. The queen's fingers tightened so hard around her glass that the stem looked ready to snap. But Mara barely noticed any of it. Her attention stayed on the king, on the way his certainty seemed to unravel thread by thread. He had married another woman. He had chosen a different path. He had walked away from her once and never looked back, or so she had believed. And yet now, one look at her was undoing him in front of everyone he had invited to witness his triumph. That was the cruel beauty of memory. It never asked permission before returning. The king finally took a step forward, then stopped, as though some unseen force had drawn a line across the floor. His voice, when it came, was lower than the music and rough with restraint. Mara. It was only her name, but in his mouth it sounded like confession. The word passed through the hall and changed the air around them. Mara felt it in her chest, in the small place where old hurt still lived beside old hope. She had not expected him to speak so soon. She had not expected anything at all from a man who had already taught her what abandonment felt like. Still, the sound of her name and his voice reopened something she had sealed for years. He looked at her as if every path he had taken had suddenly led him here, to this exact moment, to the woman he had once failed to remember. And when he spoke again, the certainty in his tone was gone, replaced by something far more vulnerable. I know you. The words were quiet, but they struck harder than a shout. A few guests drew in sharp breaths. The queen turned her head toward him in disbelief. Mara did not move. She only stood there, feeling the weight of a truth too large to hold at once. He knew her now. But knowledge was not the same as love, and memory was not the same as repentance. Not yet. Not until he proved that this second chance meant more than a moment of shock. The queen's hand tightened around her glass, but Mara barely noticed. Her attention stayed fixed on the king, on the way his posture had changed since he said the words I know you. It was not just surprise now. It was strain, as if some invisible weight had settled across his shoulders and made every breath harder to take. Mara had seen proud men falter before, but this was different. This was the look of someone standing at the edge of a memory he had spent years refusing to face. The banquet hall remained unnaturally still. Even the music had softened into something distant and uncertain, as if the entire room understood that a turning point had arrived and none of them should dare interrupt it. The king's eyes moved over her face with painful slowness, as though he were searching for an answer written in the lines of her expression. I should have known, he said at last, and the quiet in his voice made the words feel heavier than anything shouted. Mara's throat tightened. She did not trust herself to answer. She had once waited for him to look at her this way when they were young and no one had yet trained her into silence. Back then, she had believed recognition would arrive like a blessing. Now it came dressed in regret, and regret was a colder thing. "You remember enough to say that," she managed, keeping her voice level even as her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. A faint change crossed his face, one she could not name at first. Shame, perhaps. Or the first real crack in the wall he had built around himself. He took a single step toward her, then stopped, as if he feared that any closer would force him to confront more truth than he could bear. "No," he said quietly. "I remember enough to know I failed you." The words struck the air between them like a bell. Several heads turned at once. The Queen's expression hardened, not with anger alone, but with the sharp calculation of someone who understood that the room had shifted and that power was no longer moving in a straight line. Mara felt every eye in the hall settle on her again, but for once their attention did not wound as deeply. He had spoken. He had admitted something. Not enough. Never enough. But more than she had expected from him in all these years of being forgotten. Her fingers brushed the edge of the table, seeking steadiness. "Failing someone is one thing," she said, her tone soft but clear. "Leaving them to live with it is another." The king closed his eyes for a brief moment, and when he opened them, the restraint in his face had thinned even further. He looked older somehow, not in years but in burden, as if that one sentence had forced him to carry the full shape of his past at last. "Tell me what was lost," he said. "And I will not turn away again." Mara almost laughed at the cruel simplicity of it. As though truth could be gathered in a single sentence. As though wounds that had shaped her life could be answered by standing closer and sounding sincere. But beneath her disbelief, a small, stubborn part of her still listened. Still wondered. Still feared what it meant that the man who had once let her disappear was now looking at her as if she were the only thing in the room that mattered. The Queen did not move, but the air around her seemed to tighten as Mara spoke. Every word settled into the banquet hall like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples reached farther than anyone expected. The king stood very still at the center of it all, his face unreadable for one long breath, then two, as if he were forcing himself to remain composed while something inside him came apart quietly. Mara watched him with a guarded calm, though her heart was no calmer than the flame light trembling across the crystal glasses. She had not come here to wound him. She had come because truth, once spoken, had a way of demanding its own shape. Around them, the guests had gone silent enough to hear the faint crackle of the hearth. Even the musicians near the far wall had lowered their instruments, uncertain whether to keep playing or vanish into the shadows. The king finally looked away from Mara and toward the Queen, and that single movement seemed to drain the warmth from the room. The Queen's expression remained polished, but her fingers had gone white around the stem of her glass. She knew what this silence meant. She knew what recognition could destroy. "You are shaking," Mara said softly, not to accuse him, but because she could see it now, the strain he had tried so hard to hide. He drew in a measured breath, then another, before answering. "I am trying to remember carefully," he said. His voice was quieter than before, roughened at the edges by something that sounded dangerously close to remorse. Mara almost looked away. She had expected denial, or distance, or the kind of cold dismissal that could protect a man from his own conscience. Instead, he sounded like someone standing barefoot at the edge of a road he had once abandoned, realizing there was no clean way to return. "Carefully does not undo what was careless," she said. The words were gentle, but they carried farther than a shout. Several guests lowered their eyes. A few did not. The king's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she entered the hall, Mara saw him not as a ruler wrapped in ceremony, but as a man caught by the full weight of his own past. He looked at her wrist again, at the faded mark there, and something in his expression softened into pain. Not the clean kind that passes quickly. The kind that lingers. The kind that changes a person if they are honest enough to let it. I do not ask for forgiveness, he said at last. Only the chance to understand what I failed to see. Mara held his gaze, searching for the familiar crack in the performance, the moment when his regret might turn out to be only another royal courtesy. But there was no ease in him now. No polished excuse. Just a man who had finally reached the place where memory could no longer be called a rumor. Then understand this, she said, her voice low and steady. Being forgotten hurts in ways people never see. The words did not break the silence. They deepened it. And in that deeper silence, the king's shoulders lowered by a fraction, as if he had finally felt the full weight of what she was saying. Not the story of a lost woman. The story of a life she had been forced to build from the wreckage of his absence. When he spoke again, it was with a seriousness that changed the shape of the room. Show me where it began. Mara's breath caught. Not because the request was dramatic, but because it was real. It was not a promise yet. It was not enough to heal anything. But it was the first thing he had said that sounded like the beginning of effort instead of regret. The king did not speak again until the hall had settled into a careful silence, the kind that came when every servant, noble, and guard understood that something permanent had changed. Mara could feel eyes on her from every direction, but for the first time, the weight of them did not make her shrink. Not because she was suddenly fearless. Because she was no longer standing alone inside the memory of what she had lost. He had asked her to show him where it began. The words had not sounded like a performance. They had sounded like a man stepping toward a truth he could no longer outrun. And that, more than any apology, made her chest ache with caution. She led him away from the brightest tables and the soft clink of crystal, past the long banquet windows where moonlight silvered the polished floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from fear of the room behind them, but from the strange, fragile hope gathering in her throat. If he truly wanted the beginning, then he would have to face more than a story. He would have to face the version of her that had once waited for him and been left behind. They reached the narrower corridor beyond the banquet hall, where the music faded into a distant murmur. Here, the air was cooler. Quieter. More honest. Mara stopped beneath a wall lantern and folded her hands together to keep them from trembling. The king stood a few feet away, no crown in his hands, no public mask on his face. Only a man trying, perhaps for the first time in years, to look at the consequences of his own life without turning away. You were not the only one who remembered that night, he said softly. Mara almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. Then why did it take so long for you to say anything? The question landed between them with painful clarity. He lowered his gaze for a moment, and when he lifted it again, there was no defense left in him. Because I thought memory was enough, he said. Because I told myself time would erase what I failed to protect. Mara felt the old hurt rise, familiar as a scar pressed in the dark. Time had never erased anything for her. It had only taught her how to carry it without being heard. It did not erase me, she said. The king's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. He only listened, and somehow that was worse. It taught me how to become smaller, she continued, her voice steady even as her heart beat hard against her ribs. How to stop expecting a hand that never came. How to stop looking toward doors that stayed closed. A shadow moved through his expression then, something raw and deeply human. He looked as though each word was finding the exact bruise it was meant to touch. Mara, he said, and the way he spoke her name was different now. Not formal. Not distant. Almost reverent. She held his gaze despite the hurt in it, despite the part of her that still wanted to turn away before hope could wound her again. If you want the beginning, she said, then you need to understand what it cost me to survive it. He answered at once, quietly, then I will listen. And in that small vow, spoken in a corridor outside a feast built on silence, something long buried began to shift. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the first honest sign that regret, if it was real, could still become something worthy of the woman who had been forgotten. Mara did not answer right away. She stood in the quiet corridor where the banquet noise had faded into a low, distant murmur, and let the king wait long enough to feel it. Not punishment. Just truth. He had asked for the beginning, and the beginning was never a soft thing. It arrived with the memory of cold floors, closed doors, and the particular kind of silence that teaches a woman how small the world can make her feel. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of years. "You want to understand what it cost me," she said. "Then do not ask for the polished version." The king did not move. He only watched her with that same careful attention, as though every word mattered more than his own breath. Mara turned her face toward the window at the end of the corridor. Pale moonlight touched the stone, and for a moment she could almost pretend she was somewhere else, somewhere before memory became survival. "It began long before the feast," she said. "Long before anyone in that hall decided I was worth remembering." The words were simple, but they pulled the past forward with them. She saw herself again as a younger woman, standing at the edge of a crowded room while others spoke over her, past her, around her. She had learned early how to disappear without leaving. Not because she wanted to. Because she had been trained by disappointment. Beside her now, the king seemed to understand that this was not a story she could tell quickly. His shoulders lowered by a fraction. He said nothing, and that silence gave her room to continue. "I spent years believing that if I was patient enough, kind enough, useful enough, someone would eventually look at me and see me as more than a shadow." Her mouth tightened, but she kept going. "Instead, I became very good at not asking for anything. I made myself small in every room. I smiled when it hurt. I thanked people for scraps of attention because I did not know what else to do with hope." The king's gaze shifted, not away from her, but deeper, as if he were trying to find the place where those words had lodged inside him. Mara did not soften for him. She could not. Not yet. "There was a night," she said, "when I waited by a door until my legs went numb. I told myself he would come. I told myself there had to be some mistake, some reason, some kindness left in the world that had not yet reached me. But the door stayed closed." Her breath caught, not from drama, but from memory. "That was the night I understood something terrible. Sometimes being forgotten is not an accident. Sometimes it is a choice made by people who know you will still be there tomorrow." The king's face changed at that. Not into anger. Into shame. Deep, unguarded shame. And Mara saw it, saw the first honest crack in the careful armor he had worn so long. But she did not rush to comfort him. She let the silence stand between them like a witness. "I survived," she said quietly. "That is what no one in that hall seemed to understand. I did not survive because I was rescued. I survived because I learned how to live with being unloved and still remain whole." The words hung there, and for the first time, he looked as if he could not bear to look away. "Mara," he said softly, but she shook her head once. Not to reject him. To keep him from interrupting the truth. "If you want redemption," she murmured, "you need to hear the part where I stopped waiting for it." And as she stood beneath the moonlit window, with the king listening in the narrow corridor outside a world that had once ignored her, the past no longer felt buried. It felt near enough to touch. And that was the danger of this moment, Mara thought. Not that he had returned. But that for the first time, she was beginning to believe he might stay long enough to deserve what he had broken. The corridor had gone so still that Mara could hear the soft turn of the king's breath beside her. The feast beyond the archway was only a distant murmur now, a world of crystal glasses and careful lies fading behind stone walls and moonlight. He stood there without his crown, without the armor of ceremony, looking less like a ruler and more like a man who had finally been forced to face the cost of his own choices. Mara did not soften at the sight. She had already spent too many years being soft for people who mistook it for permission. "You asked me what I need," she said at last, her voice quiet but steady. "So listen carefully." He did. Every line of his body went still. There was no interruption now, no polished answer ready at his tongue. Only attention. Only regret. Mara folded her hands together so he would not see them tremble. It would have been easier to cry, easier to let grief spill out and turn this moment into something gentler. But gentleness had not saved her before. Truth had. "I need you to stop treating my pain like a page you can turn back," she said. "You married another woman. The kingdom watched. I watched. And while everyone else moved forward, I learned how to survive inside the part of history that people prefer to forget." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He knew better than to defend himself now. The silence between them did not feel empty. It felt earned. Beyond the window, the moonlight touched the stone floor in a pale silver line, and Mara realized she had never stood in a moment like this before, one where the man who had once abandoned her was finally listening without asking her to make it easier. That, more than any apology, made her chest ache. "If you want to stay," she continued, turning her face toward the dim light, "then stay as the man who remembers what he broke. Not as the king who expects to be forgiven because he has finally noticed what was lost." The words landed hard, but they were not cruel. They were honest. And honesty, after so much silence, felt almost sacred. The king lowered his gaze for a long moment, as if he were looking at the floor to keep from falling apart. When he spoke again, his voice was rougher than before. "I do remember," he said. "Every day." Mara let out a slow breath. "Then you remember one more thing," she whispered. "I was not lost. I was left." The sentence remained in the corridor like a bell after it has been struck, clear and impossible to ignore. He flinched, not from anger, but from the truth of it. There was no defense for that. No explanation that could make abandonment sound like destiny. For the first time since he had found her again, the king looked afraid, not of her rejection, but of the weight of being seen clearly. Mara felt that fear, and she did not rush to rescue him from it. He had spent years leaving her alone with her own loneliness. He could stand inside his for a while. Outside, the wind moved softly through the gardens, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant roses through the open window. Somewhere below, a song began and then faded, fragile as memory. Mara looked up at the night sky and let the silence settle around her like a cloak. The hurt was still there. It would be there for a long time. But something else had begun, too. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Only the first thin thread of possibility, drawn between the woman he had forgotten and the man who was finally learning that love meant more than wanting what had once been easy to overlook. He took one careful step closer, then stopped, as if he understood that even a single step could be too much if taken without permission. "What happens now?" he asked. Mara did not answer immediately. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time she saw not a king made powerful by title, but a broken man standing at the edge of his own remorse, waiting to learn whether he could become worthy of the woman history had tried to erase. Her voice, when it came, was soft and certain. "Now," she said, "you begin by proving that your regret can become something gentler than your pride ever was." And in the hush that followed, beneath moonlight and old sorrow, the future did not arrive like a miracle. It arrived like a door opening slowly, one deliberate inch at a time. What came next was not forgiveness, and Mara did not mistake it for that. The king had learned, in the hard silence between one breath and the next, that regret without action was only another kind of vanity. So he remained where he was, hands loose at his sides, waiting while moonlight pooled along the stone floor and softened the sharp edges of the corridor. Mara watched him with the careful stillness of someone who had spent too many years learning not to trust sudden tenderness. The feast behind them continued in fragments of distant laughter and fading music, but it no longer belonged to them. Here, in the quiet, there was only the old hurt, the new uncertainty, and the fragile space between. "You said I begin by proving it," he said at last, his voice low and unadorned. Mara did not look away. "Yes," she answered. Not with words. With choices. He nodded once, as if he had expected nothing easier. Then, to her surprise, he turned his head toward the archway and spoke to the guard standing just beyond it. His voice carried without force, but it did not need force. "Bring back the seat that was removed from the table," he said. "And tell the staff the woman who stands beside me is to be treated as my honored guest." The guard hesitated only a moment before bowing and disappearing into the hall. Mara felt the air shift. It was not grand. It was not enough to repair what had been broken for years. But it was real, and reality had a weight that empty apologies never carried. The king looked back at her, and for the first time there was something almost humble in his expression, something stripped bare by his own honesty. "I know this does not undo anything," he said. "I know that." Mara folded her hands together to keep them steady. She could feel the shape of old bitterness in her chest, but beneath it there was another feeling now, quieter and more dangerous, because it asked her to hope. "Then do not ask me to pretend it does," she said. "I will not," he answered. "I only ask for the chance to become better than the man who let you stand alone." The words settled between them, plain and heavy, and she understood then that he was not asking to be absolved. He was asking to be tested. That was different. That was honest. Somewhere beyond the corridor, the hall had gone quieter, as if even the pack could sense that something had changed and did not yet know how to name it. Mara lifted her chin, feeling the faint tug of destiny where pain had once lived. "Then start with tomorrow," she said. "Start by showing me whether this kingdom can make room for truth." His gaze held hers, steady now, no longer cloaked in ceremony. "It will," he said. "If I must tear through every lie to make it so." Mara almost smiled at that, though it was not a smile born from ease. It was the kind that came when someone finally said the right thing after years of silence. Outside, the moon hung pale and watchful above the palace walls. Inside, a woman who had been forgotten at last stood in the light of being seen, and a king who had once chosen too late began, one careful breath at a time, to learn that redemption was not a crown. It was a responsibility. By the time the first pale line of morning touched the palace stones, Mara had already walked the length of the East Gallery twice, her hands folded so tightly that her fingers had gone numb. She was not waiting for a confession anymore. She was waiting for proof. That was what the king had asked for, and more importantly, it was what she needed if she was ever going to believe that yesterday had not been a beautiful mistake. Across the hall, servants moved quietly with trays of tea and fresh bread, careful not to disturb the stillness that had settled over the palace after the feast. Even the air felt changed. Less ceremonial. More human. When the king finally appeared at the far end of the gallery, he was no longer dressed for a court. He wore a simple dark coat, the kind that made him look less like a ruler and more like a man determined to keep a promise. Mara watched him approach, and something inside her pulled tight, wary and hopeful at once. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for her to see the exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that came from a night spent thinking too hard about what had been lost. "I had the council gather before sunrise," he said quietly. Mara's expression did not change, but her attention sharpened. "For what?" "For the truth." His voice was steady, though she could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "They will review every decision made in the years you were dismissed, overlooked, and sent away with nothing but silence." Mara looked at him for a long moment. She had expected grand words. She had expected regret wrapped in poetry. This was different. This was work. This was uncomfortable. This was real. "And if they refuse?" she asked. The king met her gaze without blinking. "Then they will refuse in front of me." A small breath escaped her before she could stop it. Not laughter. Not yet. Something softer than that. Something almost like relief. He stepped closer, not touching her, only standing near enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the morning chill. "I know what I broke," he said. I know that one apology does not rebuild years. So I am not asking you to believe me today. Mara swallowed, the ache in her chest turning slow and heavy. That was the most honest thing he had said to her yet. Then what are you asking? The king glanced toward the window where the sunlight was climbing, thin and gold, across the palace floor. I am asking for the chance to make my kingdom worthy of you before I ask anything else from your heart. For a moment, Mara could not answer. The words did not erase the past. They did not heal the old wounds that still lived under her skin. But they did something else. They gave shape to a future that was not built on excuses. She turned slightly, looking out over the grounds where the pack had begun to stir, where life was moving forward whether she trusted it or not. Then start with the people, she said at last. Not with me. He nodded once, as if he had been expecting that answer all along. I already have. Before she could ask what he meant, footsteps sounded at the end of the gallery. Not guards. Not nobles. Children. 3 of them, small and uncertain, hovered in the doorway carrying a folded blanket and a shallow wooden bowl. Mara recognized them as the youngest from the lower quarter, the ones who used to duck away whenever court members passed. The eldest girl looked up at Mara with wide, solemn eyes. The king said the old healer's room should be fixed, she said. He said you might want a place with sunlight. Mara stared at the child, then at the king. He did not look pleased with himself. He looked determined, and strangely vulnerable, as if this small kindness mattered more to him than all the titles in the palace. Mara let her fingers loosen. The blanket was plain, the bowl simple, but the gesture struck deeper than silk or gold ever could. It was an answer given in action, not speech. The kind that reached the parts of her that still waited to be disappointed. She accepted the blanket from the child, feeling the soft wool against her palms, and for the first time that morning, her breath did not catch. The king watched her quietly. Not triumphant. Not demanding. Only present. You can decide what belongs to you now, he said. Your room. Your work. Your place here. Mara looked down at the blanket, then back at him. Somewhere beyond the gallery, the palace bells rang once, clear and low, and the sound seemed to settle around them like a blessing that had taken too long to arrive. Then I will begin with the room, she said. And tomorrow, we will see whether the rest of this kingdom can learn the same lesson. The king bowed his head, not as a ruler receiving loyalty, but as a man accepting a beginning. And as Mara followed the children toward the room that had once been hers and never truly had been, the morning light spread across the stone floor behind her, patient and bright, as if even the palace itself understood that redemption was not a single moment. It was a series of small doors finally left open. Mara did not need another promise. By morning, she needed something steadier than words. She needed the kingdom to notice the work of her hands. So when the palace stewards came for the corridor linens and found every candle freshened, every window unlatched to the sun, and every chair returned to its proper place, they paused as if they had walked into a room they no longer knew how to enter. Mara only kept moving. She carried folded cloth to the children's chamber, set warm water by the bedside table, and adjusted the small blanket she had stitched herself during the long years of being overlooked. The king found her there just before noon, standing at the window with her sleeve rolled to the elbow and a quiet, thoughtful look on her face. He did not speak at once. He had learned that silence, if used carefully, could be a form of respect. The records clerk confirmed it, he said at last. Your assignments were altered 3 winters ago. Your name was removed from the healing roster before the council vote ever reached me. Mara's throat tightened, but she did not turn. The truth had a way of arriving too late to soften, and yet it still mattered. So I was not forgotten by accident, she said softly. No, he answered. You were made to disappear. The words settled between them, not as an injury this time, but as a fact he was finally willing to carry without flinching. Mara looked down at her hands, then back out toward the bright courtyard where 2 small children were chasing one another near the fountain, their laughter lifting into the air like bells. "Then let the kingdom know what was done," she said. "Not to punish. To restore." The king nodded once, slowly, as if he understood that restoration would ask more of him than regret ever had. Before the hour was over, he had ordered the steward to bring the council seals, the old ledgers, and every formal notice tied to Mara's removal. One by one, he would have the truth entered into record. One by one, he would give her back the place that had been stolen in ink and silence. Mara listened to the first pages turn and felt something inside her loosen. Not trust, not yet. But room. And that was how healing began here, in a palace that had once been too proud to admit its own mistakes. By evening, the king walked with her through the east gallery where moonlight gathered across the stone floor, and this time he did not ask her to forgive him. He asked her what she wanted the future to look like. Mara did not answer quickly. She thought of the children, the workroom, the quiet window, the life she had almost learned to live without. Then she lifted her chin and said, "I want a place where no one is made small to keep others comfortable. I want my work respected. I want the girls in this palace to grow up knowing they are not disposable." The king's gaze lowered, not in shame alone, but in understanding. "Then we begin there," he said. And for the first time, that promise did not sound like redemption spoken too soon. It sounded like the first stone set into a road that might finally lead somewhere good. By the time the winter sun rose over the palace gardens, the kingdom had already begun to feel different, as if the air itself had learned to breathe more softly. Mara stood at the long window of the workroom, one hand resting on the sill, watching children cross the courtyard with fresh scarves around their necks and color returning to faces that had once looked too tired for hope. Behind her, shelves of folded cloth, repaired hems, and neatly sorted supplies stood like quiet proof that something patient and real had taken root here. The king found her there just before noon, without ceremony, without guards, without the pride that used to arrive ahead of him. He only came to stand beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke. Below them, the palace moved on with its ordinary sounds, but even ordinary sounds felt gentler now. Mara had learned not to mistake silence for emptiness. Sometimes silence was only the space where truth was finally allowed to settle. "The council has agreed," he said at last. "The women's workrooms will remain open. The kitchens will be restructured. The old rules will be rewritten." Mara did not look at him right away. Her eyes stayed on the courtyard, where one small girl was laughing so hard she had to hold her sides. "Good," she said, and the word carried no triumph, only relief. The king nodded once, as if he understood that relief could be more sacred than applause. By evening, the palace lanterns were lit early, their warm glow spilling across the halls in soft amber streams. Servants passed without lowering their eyes. Stewards spoke to Mara with the kind of respect that did not need to be announced. And when the king stepped into the great hall and called for the court to gather, the room fell into a stillness so complete it felt almost like prayer. He did not stand on the highest dais. He stood on the floor with everyone else, his shoulders squared, his voice steady. "I made choices that cost this kingdom more than I knew," he said. "But tonight, we begin again with honesty." Then he turned, and his gaze found Mara in the open doorway, where she had paused as though unsure whether to enter a place that had once made her invisible. For one breath, the whole hall held still. Then he crossed to her, not as a ruler claiming what was his, but as a man asking with his entire being for the chance to be worthy of the woman before him. "You were never forgotten to the moon," he said quietly. "Only to me. And I will carry that truth for the rest of my life." Mara's chest tightened, not with pain now, but with the strange ache that comes when something long broken begins, at last, to mend. She looked past him at the faces of the court, at the children in the doorway, at the women standing straighter than they had before, and she saw a future that no longer belonged to regret. It belonged to work, to tenderness, to earn trust. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. Not as surrender. Not as rescue. As a choice. And when the king bowed his head over her fingers, the hall did not cheer. It did something quieter and perhaps more powerful. It witnessed. Outside, the first stars appeared above the palace roof, one by one, as if the night itself were signing a promise older than pride and gentler than loss. Mara lifted her face to that dark, open sky and felt, for the first time, that being chosen was no longer the point. Being truly seen was. And in that sight, in that silence, in that fragile and luminous beginning, the kingdom finally became the place where she had always deserved to belong.